golly, where to start? You know, it's like we all communicate every day, and we live in a society that has a view of communication which is not of our making. We inherited it. And we inherited it from a really groovy place called modernism. All right? And I certainly think we would prefer to have modernism than superstition and dogma as a way of driving our worlds. But, and you'll forgive me if on the way I throw out the names of authors that I think you absolutely have to read to exist in this world, because that's who I am. There's a guy named Stephen Toulmin who died last year, who wrote a book called Cosmopolis. And in it he apologizes, because he was one of the great, what you would call neo-positivist philosophers. He believed in modernity. He believed that the tools of science and the tools of objectivity would not only allow us to bridge the gaps between us and our external world, but the gaps between each other. So if we could only learn to communicate well with each other, we would solve our problems and our diversity issues would go away. And honestly, for a long time, as we came out of modernity, those were the beliefs, which, as we can witness the world, sort of fell apart. Right? But we still have that legacy. We still have organizations. The very fact that I'm sitting here and you're sitting there, and that we already have technology where you could have a little computer screen in front of you which would light up with, you know, red, I didn't like what you just said, or green, I liked what you just said, or blue, I'm very confused now, or, you know, so that I could have constant feedback from you. The very fact that we still create our systems with structure, information, and technology in their center rather than human beings in their center tells us a lot about this legacy of modernity that we have brought to the modern world. And what Stephen Toulmin says, it's a wonderful little book because it's a scholar's book, but it doesn't have any footnotes except way in the back. And he starts with, I'm sorry, I apologize, I was wrong. We brought forward the technology, the quest for precision and accuracy and control of our environment from the sciences, and we left behind the rich, deep skepticism of the humanities and the romanticists. And they should have marched forward together, because if they had marched forward together, we would not now be so shocked by all these people who don't agree with us. All right, all the way from, should the ladies in the room have a mammogram? Well, go online. All right, it will take you exactly 5 minutes to find scientific evidence that says no. And another 5 minutes to find scientific evidence that says yes. And you'll learn that women in France don't have them as often. And that's curious. You know, how come? Right? Or that children in France somehow don't have attention deficit disorder as often as children in the United States. How interesting. All right? And these differences in science alone don't talk to each other. Right? Now you get to human beings, you know, like social order and culture and etc. And there are differences there too. And what I say in general is that, and I consider culture to be part of structure, information, and technology. All right. So what I say about culture and community is we must understand them. It is necessary to understand them, but they ain't gonna solve the communication problem. Because no woman is an average woman, no Hispanic is an average Hispanic, you know, no Black American is an average Black American. There is more diversity within these groups than between these groups and other groups if you think communicatively. Now, if you're trying to predict habitual behavior, that's a different issue, all right? But communication, when you're an organization and you want to establish long-term, good, human, compassionate relationships with your constituencies, internal and external. It can't be done with this model. All right, and so this is the model that I'm going to talk about and bring to the ground briefly. And some of you in the room may quiver and say, oh my goodness, this is my belief system, and she's taking it to the ground, okay? So as I'm doing that, remember that there are times when we do want to predict people in their little groups, right? We want to predict that men are different than women on average. All right, now I do recommend another book to you by DeidreMcCluskey called The Cult of Statistical Significance. And the subtitle is something like How the Standard Error is Ruining Our Lives, Justice, Health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right? So Deidre is essentially taking to the ground the statistical model that runs the social sciences and runs the medical sciences and, in fact, the physical sciences. And she's not alone. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, was with her. All right? So it's sort of like we have the normative things we're doing communicatively in the world, and then we have some folks over here and some folks over here who are saying, there's something wrong here. We need to look at this, all right? And it's hard to get it on the plate. And so today you happen to have among you one of the lunatics who's trying to get it on the plate. So here we are. Now, remember, I started as a journalist. I wasn't very successful as a journalist. That was because the Pope's encyclical, I'm an old lady, remember? The first Pope's encyclical came out, and my job as a journalist was to write a story. And it never occurred to me that the only person I was allowed to interview was the bishop. I mean, I went and interviewed women, and I found out this amazing thing, which is women of childbearing age, mind you, this is 1970s, all right? Women of childbearing age, regardless of religion, were acutely aware of the Pope's encyclical, and no one else was. Interesting. Should have gotten into the newspaper, didn't. Replicated it as a study at Michigan State, got these incredibly statistical significant findings, right? So, I mean, this is women of any religion of childbearing age, all right? And my own advisor said he didn't understand it, so I never sent it to a journal, which was a mistake, because it would have gotten in. So here we are. Structured information technology is at the heart of the system. And we build our systems on stereotypes of human beings because we haven't figured out how to put human beings into the heart of the system. Now, that doesn't mean that you as an individual don't. What we know about, for example, social workers in practice is they burn out. And the reason they burn out is that they are the ones who stand between the system, which isn't very human, and the human being who demands humanity. Right? Nurses burn out for the same reason. Teachers burn out. Librarians burn out. Reference librarians quickly burn out. All right? And the humane doctors burn out, right? Because we've done a lot of work looking at that. So now let me see there. I of course, have to reduce things to simplicities, and so I reduce this to a culprit called the information brick, which is our legacy from modernity, that we were going to have accurate information. And it was going to allow us, if we could only frame our messages properly, to communicate well with other human beings, right? A noble goal. And I, as a journalist, planned to do that until I ran into my first major difficulty. We essentially have been taught to think. And I think what you need to do is think of the time when you collide with expertise, which is the hardest for you personally. Now, whether that's, oh, thank you. See, by the way, morning news, I shouldn't be drinking this, right? I should be drinking coffee, right?
It's almost lunch in Ohio, right?
That's right, okay, I'm allowed, right? That what we've been taught is, medicine has been taught this, journalism has been taught this, nursing has been taught this, although they're the ones that know it doesn't work, right? Social work has been taught this, but they know it doesn't work, is that somehow people are sort of lopping along on our life path, all right? And so if you think about yourself going to Micro Center, or whatever your local computer store is, where the computer expert stands there with a bunch of words that you do not understand and assumes that you understand every one of them and that you know how all the pieces fit together, and and you try to ask a question and you're treated like an idiot. All right, and then, I usually say, hey, I have 2 PhDs, you don't have to talk to me that way, and it has no impact whatsoever, all right? So it's not their fault, all right? It's like the system has a hierarchy of knowledge, and they've paid a price to get it, all right? And we certainly don't want to throw those hierarchies of knowledge out. I mean, if you want me to go to the moon, I want that knowledge out there. I'm not going to throw the science baby out with the bathwater, even though I stand with Richard Feynman, the man who found out why the Challenger crashed. If you haven't read that book, I think it's called Innovative Evidence. All right. He when he was dying of cancer, he served on the Challenger Commission, and he came in one morning. The data was in the data grids. And Hans Bethe called Richard Feynman the most unstuck mind I have ever met. And that's because Richard Feynman, who in fact, IQ is a creation of a system too, but his IQ, as measured by our system, was only 123, which is not genius. All right, and he was called the greatest genius physics ever knew. Right. And the reason why is that he would approach every new system with no preconceptions from his prior knowledge. And that's what his father taught him to do. Right? So he blithely came in, and the chair of the Challenger Commission knew that Richard was a little bit of a troublemaker, and he said, oh God, what is this man going to do today? Because he came in with a glass of water, and he came in with a handful of screws. And he said, please get me some ice. And oh my God, all right? And then he put the screws in the ice, and a half an hour later he took them out and he slammed his hand on the table, and the screws shattered. Because the screws they were using, and it was in the data grids, but nobody was able to read it, both because of impasses in communication and because of a lack of acceptability of brainstorming. All right, of going, hey, what's going on in our data that we're not looking at yet? All right, maybe we should be looking at it. All right, and they wouldn't allow that to happen. All right, and so he solved the problem. All right, much to the distress of Nasser. So here we are with the burden of this picture of human beings as if they have the information habit, that they come to us ready, right, to receive via a hypodermic model, and this is an old model in the field of communication, the information that we have, we're going to transmit it to them, all right, throw it at them. And here on one side, here in this room, for example, I'm the one with the smile on the face. I have the brick in my head. You poor dears, are out there, you do not have the brick in your head. And I'm going to throw it at you, all right, and you're expected to catch it. Right. And then, of course, we have tons of stuff we want to get into other people's heads. Right? It's a big burden for them. And then, of course, we put all the data and the information in a cave. All right, and we have people who are experts at getting it out of the cave, but this has kind of run away with us. So, for example, now that all of the contradictions in medical knowledge are running amok on the web, all right, the old hierarchical forms of codifying medical knowledge, it's falling apart, right? And they don't have anything to take its place. What they do have is, like I counted last week, 150 studies that go, oh, woe is us, woe is me, woe is us. Everyday, average, illiterate, ignorant citizens like me, all right, are getting misinformation about medicine on the web all the time. Woe is us, woe is me, right? And there's nothing, and I'm going to start using this word dialogic. There's nothing dialogic except for what I call the new sixth theory of communication, and I'll come back to this, which is chaos is fine. All right, so everybody can talk to everybody, and everybody can say anything they damn please everywhere on the web, as long as the corporate sector doesn't take it over. And if you read a book called, oh, see, I'm not going to remember the name of this book, but it's a book about the history of information technology and how every single information technology eventually gets privatized. And the expectation is that the web, it will happen to the web, right? Radio, for example, when it started was a people's media, right? Any Joe Blow could start a radio station, and you could do it in your community, and you didn't have to have a license, right? And you could talk to people you wanted, and then you could have a shortwave radio and talk all over the world, and it was entirely a people's medium, just like, in a sense, the internet is right now. So we have all sorts of people to codify and store the information in the caves, and they do look a little harried because it's kind of tough. When we communicate as institutions, we are necessarily extremely narcissistic, and that's not bad, right? Of course we worry about our services, our dreams, our plans, our rules, our schedules, and we want people to hop to that. Right, and so when you, for example, when you go to the library, and I've gotten an extraordinary amount of money from library science, I think because library science realized early on, as minority voices began to get mouthy, right, in this country, they were the ones on the cutting line. And so they had to serve, for example, a whole Vietnamese community in Sacramento, California that disappeared out of nowhere. I mean, appeared out of nowhere. Where did it come from? And there it was all of a sudden, and they had to serve it. So they turned to trying to understand communication one-on-one very quickly. And most of my research, I've had about $10 million in funded research in 1970 dollars. I think 90% of that has been from library science. And they, of course, you know, you go to the library and they have their category schemes and their way of doing things, and they expect you to hop in line. And so what essentially has happened is that normatively, at least in structural design, I'm not talking about you as a person, because my hunch is you as a person break out of this a lot and then go home tired, because breaking out of it a lot is very tiring. All right, so as a system, we expect these empty recipient bucket heads to arrive waiting to be filled. And we expect them to, you know, we're loving and we have only the best of intentions at heart, and we expect them to be like us. Right? We use our vocabulary, our way of looking at the world, our nouns for organizing knowledge, I mean, even, you know, it's like, sometimes I think, what the hell is social work? All right, I'm not a social worker, what is it? All right, and I'll ask a social worker and I get a bunch of words, and after I'm done, I don't know what I've heard. All right, or even, I just came from Boise State, and there were 4 faculty members there who were quite convinced they knew a great deal more than I about everything. And, right, and I think they did, because, you know, they would talk for 5 minutes, and I would not have the vaguest idea what they said. Because they used all these words, and I kept wanting to say, what do you mean by that word? What do you mean by that word? What do you mean by that word? Even though I knew the word, all right? I had no idea how they got all those words together. Well, this is what we do. We expect people to come ready to comprehend our words. And this is what we get. All right, now the trick of this, for doctors, this is the hardest part. Is anyone in the room married to a doctor? All right, because this is the toughest world for them. The compliance rate, the literature in medicine is obsessed with something called compliance. Now, if you think about that for a moment, we already know the human problem we have. We humans, of course, love to comply, right? Aye, sir, we'll do exactly what you say, sir, right? I mean, the moment you say that word, you have resistance, all right? So, essentially, in the medical community, we know that the worst study I've heard of is 1% compliance. Wow. The best study I've heard of is 25%. If you get 50% and you're a good social scientist and review the data, they've got a tautology in the data. And it's easy to do that, all right? So it's tough. I mean, people are not obeying doctor's orders, right? And it's worse and worse now because they're going online and they're finding all these other things that disagree with what the doctor just said, right? To me, these things should be put into dialogue, which I'll talk about. All right, so here we are, happy, waiting for the well-articulated question to come to us. the empty bucket that's ready to receive our knowledge, our information, our plan, our design, right? And my person here is purposely squiggly. That means that this person is both ordered and disordered. All right, and if anyone in this room is totally ordered, would you please speak to me after the lecture? Because I want to know how the hell you do it. Whatever happened, there it is, all right. I call this person Mr. Squiggly. And it's, whoops, get back there. So Mr. Squiggly comes forward to the system, which is very orderly. And what happens is that Mr. Squiggly doesn't behave as expected. And so suddenly, the system, there it is, okay. The system now is obsessed with something, predicting a need in advance. And we have a society filled with research attempting to predict needs in advance. And you can say easily to me, well, public opinion polls seem to work. And we could have now a 2-day discussion about this. But my argument to you would be, public opinion polls work only when stereotype and something called hegemony or hegemony, all right, otherwise known as power repeated and run amok, right, is running through the system. Then polls work. But in those places where people suddenly rupture against the system, polls just are not there, and it's been true all over the history. And the great public opinion pollsters, Yankelovich, who is probably the president of the Public Opinion Polling Society and the winner of every damn award that society could ever give, he has called for talking to people in different ways. He's basically arguing against public opinion polling. And then a man named Grosnick, who is probably the best known academic in public opinion polling, who was at Ohio State and left, also is calling for qualitative research. Now, in public opinion polling, that's heresy, all right, to call for public opinion, qualitative research, because qualitative research is exploratory research of a non-scientific sort. Okay, so, da-da-da, all right. Addiction time. If you can place yourself in the system you least understand and have to deal with, this is what it looks like to you. If we can get this to work there. All right? You see it through a veil darkly. All right? Because it's not your expertise. It's not your hierarchical system. You know, how can you possibly know the nouns of breast cancer, for example? All right? How can you possibly know why, for example, in 1970, when I started to do deep interviews with breast cancer patients and with terminal cancer patients, why the radiologists and the chemotherapists hated each other and argued with each other. All right, how could you possibly know that? It's not your expertise. All right, and yet they're arguing at it through you. All right, in words you don't understand and you can't possibly comprehend. So, I mean, when we did these first studies of cancer patients, it was astounding because the cancer patients wanted to talk. We had one patient who talked for 25 hours and then said to our interviewer, "I'm done now." He died that night. He left her $10,000 in his will, right? Because he was getting to tell a story that no one else wanted to listen to. So my work, I look like a dilettante on the web. Essentially what I do is I wait for, you know, nice people like Vicki to come along and say, "Ooh, I'm interested in audiences and advertising." And I say, "Good," right? And then along comes, you know, her husband and he says, "Ooh, I'm interested in users and telecommunication policy." And I say, "Oh, good," right? So my methodology is used for users, clients, audience members, patients, patrons, citizens, and by any other name, right? Whether they be the constituencies of public relations efforts, and I was in public relations, by the way, with one of the greats who called public relations compassionate action communicated effectively. All right, that's many years ago, all right? So there are two theories that have developed over the years of why our efforts to communicate fail. I like these two theories, but I like number 2 best. Right? The first theory, and I really am summarizing hundreds of studies, all right? One theory is that we, the recipients of these messages, are leaky buckets. Okay, we can't keep it in, all right? And so this is the one that teachers use, and doctors use, and journalists use, all right? My favorite one, though, is the next one, the recalcitrant bucket. This is the bucket that just refuses to be recipient to your information, your program, your plan, whatever it is, all right? Now, given that we've now failed, all right, this is the point in user studies, audience studies, constituency studies, where we have introduced multiple ways of dividing users into boxes. All right, so we have demography, capabilities, person traits, personality, cognitive emotive styles, lifestyles, domains. You know, are you a medical scientist? Are you an engineer? Task, what are you about at the moment? Are you writing a book? Are you writing an essay? Channel, what package are you going to send your information through? And institutional context, public, private, etc. All right, now the good news is, if you're trying to predict habitual behavior, plug all of those into a formula and you may account for 20% of the variance and you'll be doing damn good. All right, the problem is, put 100 people in the room, you don't know which 20 you've got, right? Because what happens when it comes to communication? Yes, you can predict who owns bigger TV sets, people with more money, right? But you cannot predict even well what they're watching, although you can do that a little. But when they're watching Law and Order, why are they watching it and what are they doing with it? All right, you can't predict that. All right, and 35 years of studies using sense-making, which I'm not going to teach you this morning, I'm just going to tease you, all right, so that if you want to learn more, you can come to my website, all right? So what happens is, I talk about the disappearing human being, and part of what I have to say goes against the grain right now, which is we are in a moment in time where culture and community is everything. So we're saying, okay, we've failed. Every other way of communicating, we failed. Now we have to be aware of culture and of community. And I absolutely agree. It is, in scientific terms, necessary, but not sufficient. Right. And the current cutting edge of anthropology agrees with me on this issue, which is that you can understand all of the cultural rules of a culture and still fail in your communicating, because no person is the average of their culture. And one of the constant, I don't know what to say, a condition of being a human being, I call it, we fight as human beings to fall in line, and we fight as human beings to fall out of line. And if we had brought forward with us, along with science, the humanities as coupled with science, we would know that, because that's where that is. That struggle to be human while being in a social group, because it's damn lonely out there if you're not in a social group, all right? But also not to be absorbed and erased by the social group, all right? That struggle is in poetry, it's in art, you know, it's in literature. It's not in science too much, because science studies the world as it is, except for Richard Feynman, right? Not the world as it might be. It studies human beings as they are, not as they are capable of other alternatives, right? And that collision, and that has been reduced in the social science literature to the collision between critical theorists and normative theorists, which I think is a artificial polarity, right? Because one of the things I take as a given about human beings is that everyone in this room is here because you have managed to navigate the issue of falling in line and falling out of line in such a way that you are not in a mental institution, right? Because people who are absolutely rigid end up in mental institutions, and you can't be rigid to survive life. And particularly life as we know it now, but I don't think it's ever been true, because if you go back to the Anansi stories of West Africa, before we had internet and global technology and everything that was going on, those stories talk about, that teenage rupture, right, where the teenager is trying to find themselves and they're rejecting everything in their culture and everything in their family, right? Well, that, I think, is a constant of the human condition and has always been a constant of the human condition, which is why we have survived as a species. Everything we can say about Mao Zedong, why did he refuse to allow his sister's feet to be bound? Why? And no one knows, but he did, all right? What a miraculous thing, right? And where did that come from, right? Cool, to me, very cool. So the issue is, our theory, which is based on putting predictive variables into big equations to try to predict people, does predict, but what it does is it predicts, I call it what Caesar owns, right? What the state owns, what the structure owns. So it will predict, for example, female behavior when female behavior is constrained by the system, right? It will predict low-income behavior when low-income behavior is constrained by the system. And it was interesting that somebody went back to the 1967 study in which Bradley Greenberg and I showed that it wasn't the state of being black versus white that made a difference in media use. It was the state of having more income and less income. And it didn't matter whether you were black or white. The income overrode it, all right? So I will talk now a lot about material circumstances, which is that, yes, we can predict habitual behavior when that behavior is constrained by the state. But communicative behavior, what you like and what you hate, and what you think about what Joe Blow just said, and whether you're going to follow doctor's orders or whether you're going to lie to doctor. And boy, patients are really good at lying to doctors, like teenagers are good at lying to their parents, right? So it doesn't predict any of that, right? It may predict whether you lie, right? But it's not going to predict how you lie and what you do next, right? So how much difference do these outsider boxes make? It depends. If the external constraints have control, the boxes predict better, but rarely well. And now I go back to DeidreMcCluskey's book, all right, how the standard error is introducing injustice and bad medicine, et cetera, et cetera. If somebody has a computer that is online, they could go to Amazon and find the subtitle of that book for me, because I'm not online here, so, because it's a cool subtitle. And anyone who is in a institution that is serving people, I think needs to know about that book and what she is trying to say. You don't need to know that story. Deidre was once Donald, and when Deidre was Donald, Donald had endowed chairs and everything at Iowa, and then Deidre became Deidre, and she still has endowed chairs at another university, all right? And that, she wrote a biography, which is the coolest thing you can read, right? Bottom line, there's always more variance. She would call it more error within the box than between one box and another box. So yes, we need to understand the categories that our society divides people in. All right, so you are a female and you are a Caucasian, at least to this outside observer, all right? I am an Italian American. You may have guessed I was Irish, but I'm an Italian American, all right? There are people in the world who are minorities, but I wouldn't try to guess, all right? And what's interesting is, as a system, the reason it doesn't work is that you take these box categories and they multiply like rabbits. All right, so if indeed we could predict, and we can't, if we could predict based on your box categories, like, I know your race, I know your religion, I know that you're a female, I know that you have X number of years of education and that you were raised in a rural environment and that your hobbies are crafting, and I'm making up a story for her, all right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know all these things about her, all right, and then I try to do it for everybody, and I have all of these categories with all of these values each, and I get 1,204, 416 different kinds of people I have to write messages for. It doesn't work. Just take this many at 4 categories each. Look at what we have, 1,048,000. It's out of control. It doesn't work. So I think we need a different way of looking at human beings. And here's Mr. Squiggly again. We need to know that that human being like us is muddling into the unknown. And every time a user, an audience member, a constituency comes to your mind, if you can put Mr. Squiggly in your mind and remember that you're Mr. or Ms. Squiggly, there is a place in your life where your intersection with, quote, expertise is as muddling and as confusing to you as your relationship is to them. Right? If we can just remember that, then we will remember that they're paying us a great honor. I tell my students, and students at Ohio State are highly diverse ethnically and racially, but they're all lowered to middle working class, often the first generation of their family to come. And I tell them that they have paid me the greatest honor. They have detoured to my room. Now, someone have been forced to come to my room and would rather have been anywhere else in the world but my room, but I still believe that the fact that they came to OSU is an honor. They've detoured off a path and changed the course of their life to come to an expert system, which on the surface may be of no value at all to them. Right? And increasingly, of course, with the challenges to intelligentsia, they come expecting less and less. Right? And I wish every country and every university in the country would have public debates on the role of the intellectual and the role of knowledge in society, because it's under attack. Of course it's under attack. But I wish we would know how to do that, both bringing the humanities forward. Right? I mean, what is religion? For example, we need to discuss that. Right? And we haven't been, because we left it behind. Science took 4. Right? And there are actually astoundingly few studies on what spirituality means to people. I've just submitted a paper to a conference in which 7 different people have used my methodology to study spirituality. One of whom, I learned to be tolerant in my old age. One of whom has studied paranormal experiences, which are, they're not my world, right? But what was very interesting is she said, your methodology, Dr. Dervin, allowed me to study this, even though this is quite strange to me. But when I read what she said, I can understand these people, right? And why they walked that path. And that helped me be tolerant of the path that they're walking, right? So what we need to do is to move from our dreams, our muddles, our needs, our struggles, our obligations, to Mr. Squiggly, who is brave and happy despite the struggles of life. And to realize that in the long run, Mr. Squiggly controls all the gates. Or Ms. Squiggly, I should be non-sexist, shouldn't I? And so I think to understand this, it's important to review some basic things we know about communication and we constantly forget. One of them is communication is a quid pro quo, period. End of sentence. All right. If you listen to me, I will listen to you. If you will ask me about my world on my terms, which is what sense making is about as a methodology, what it does is it brackets all the nouns and it puts on a set of verbing questions as alternatives. And if any of you have read Paulo Freire, it adopted this idea from him, which is we have to stop talking to people in the nouns of our world and allow people to put the nouns of their world on our plates so that we can understand their material conditions. If we keep imposing our nouns, right, we'll never hear, we'll never find out, right? So this notion of quid pro quo goes deeper than merely listening, all right? It's a way of listening and a way of asking questions of human beings, which allows them the free play to describe their worlds as they see it, and establishes the trust relationship where they're willing to do so. Right? And this, you don't do this by a miracle, but I actually teach people to do it, right? And I'd say even in tough situations, I can teach 90% of people to do it in tough situations within 10 weeks, right? That any human being can learn to ask questions differently of other human beings. And I'm going to give you a very quick example. Where's my time? Oh, I have lots of time. Unless is my watch slow? Is it 9:20?
You're fine.
Okay. We've essentially had 6 theories of communication so far. In the beginning, there was the idea that somehow out of reality would come information, boing, and it would be accurate. All right, and that one fell quickly. We then went to the artful design of messages, and rhetoric, et cetera, and that didn't work very well. A little bit better than the other one, but not very well. And so then we said, well, demographic groups. And that was a little better, but it didn't solve the problem. So then we went to personality groups and lifestyle groups and cultural groups. And clearly where we are now is the Tower of Babel. All right, the current accepted mode of communicating is spontaneous participation. Now, if you look at the data, this is dangerous because differences are not in dialogue. All right, and the more we allow this to happen, the more difficulty I think we're going to have as a human species. Because we who educate young people and we who intersect with publics need to find a way to help people be tolerant of the fact that other people see the world differently. And that not all differences between human beings need to be resolved unless you're going to call human life war. Because there are most differences between human beings, you can't make them change. Except they can make them change. They will listen to you. So, and I tell doctors, you want a patient who's a diabetic, for example, to change their diet. And there's a piece of medical science I'll agree with, all right? And the patient is having trouble with that. All right, here's some dialogic forms that will help you do that. All right, 1, have free meetings with your patients. Include in the group of patients some who struggled and succeeded, some who struggled who failed, and some who are thinking about it. Don't stand up there lecturing at them and say, damn it, you're gonna die if you don't do this. All right? Let them share with each other the struggle and the successes and the failures. One of the problems with our thing about best practices is we don't learn from best practices. We learn from worst practices, right? I'll learn more from your failure than your success, right? Because your failure is what taught you how to make that best practice, which came next, right? So I think we have a missing theory, and I've spent 40 years on it, systematic, reliable dialogue. And this is a self-portrait. I should be a little more portly. The reason it's a B, right, is that in the 1970s, there was a communication theorist, Leaky, who said that communication is like a bumblebee. The physicists say it shouldn't fly, but it flies. All right, and I think communication is like that. Communication is very, very difficult, right, if we want to bridge the gaps.